continuing from what Tamara just presented, and Ming asked me to present something on what we're doing internationally, which is really associated with IAEA. So stakeholder engaged, risk-informed decision-making and different programs at IAEA, and I will try to cross them over into the US some as well. So the decision framework is the idea, and Tamara mentioned our software-guided interactive statistical decision tools. So we pronounce it GIST. So the idea is we hope people get the gist of the problem. But really there were no URLs left that were GIST, so we stuck the word decision in there. But then that seemed applicable because actually what we're trying to do is decision analysis. So this started with the idea of stakeholder engaged structured decision making. And structured decision making is currently a term of art. It's another flavor of decision analysis, if you like. Every now and then new acronyms come up. This one came out in 2012 from Robin Gregory and his group at the University of British Columbia. They wrote a book on what they called structured decision making, which was really the very soft side of decision analysis. It's not completing the decision analysis. We might call it the deliberative side, or going out to stakeholders and finding out what matters to them. And that's about as far as they took it. If you go back to Keeney's book in 1993, Ralph Keeney, he coined a term, values-focused thinking, which is really a central part of structured decision making. This was what Gregory and his team wanted to go after, was the same ideas as Keeney, that the only reason we're trying to make a decision is because somebody cares about something. Somebody has some concerns and issues, in which case decision making should start with value judgments rather than with science, like we're more inclined to do. So that was the basis for it all, and it turned out that what Gregory wrote and what Keeney was doing were aligned very much with what we'd been doing for EPA since about 2002, where we'd been putting decision analysis programs together for EPA, basically based on values-focused thinking because we were following Keeney. So we have a software program now. My IT team tell me that we can now call it version 1, which means the next step, to answer Kathy's question, is okay, how do we release that? And so that will come next year. We just have to work out what licenses we're working under. I think somebody at Sandia talked about their open source licenses the other day. We've got to work out what licenses we're really working under, and then we'll release it. Current initiatives along these lines, getting back to international, IAEA, Tamara did mention CIDA in her presentation. So CIDA is Constraints to Implementing Decommissioning and Environmental Remediation Strategies. So this is another IAEA group. There's different groups that have different goals and objectives. Actually, the reason I'm involved in that group was Horst Munken-Fernandez, who's one of the heads of that group, came and listened to GIST presentations we were giving at Waste Management about 3 years ago. And he said, hey, that's what we need for this group. So I'll get into that a little bit more in a minute. But and then this year, Ming asked if I would come to Modaria 2 and give a presentation on what we're doing with GIST. And what was really interesting to me, and a surprise as well, I wasn't aware that Modaria was this far down the decision analysis path. But there's actually a few people within Working Group 1 that do have a decision analysis background. They're essentially all in the UK. This includes somebody by the name of Simon French at the University of Warwick, who some of you might have heard of, I don't know, but Simon claims that he invented the term MCDA, for example, multi-criteria decision analysis. He also claims that everybody's misused it since he invented it. But they say, go grab his book, you'll find it in there. And then at the last CIDA 2 meeting that we were at presenting this, some members of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development were there. And they got interested in the idea as well. And what's behind all of this really is that there are a lot of radiation contaminated sites around the world that have problems, and the problems are often very different than the ones we face here. Those problems are usually driven much more by lack of available funding, much more severely than here. If we think we're lacking funding here at the moment, then compared to these countries around the world, we're joking. And political issues and cultural issues and religious issues. It's a different environment out there, and we'd argue that the process for solving problems is the same, but now you've got to address a completely different set of attributes or objectives. So current initiatives in the US, I said we tailor this software for different groups. What we tailored for EPA is called DASIS. DASIS is Decision Analysis for a Sustainable Economy, Environment and Society. Those three things at the end are the three pillars of sustainability. And so that's what this was aimed at for EPA. There's been a broad array of applications now for EPA, including actually crossing over with some circular projects, because there was some interest in how something like this structured decision-making approach could be merged with circular to make circular more effective. So there's a couple of those going on right now. But coral reef management, watershed management, looking at how a pig farm operates, contamination from it. There's different resiliency planning. That was interesting. That was Florida, after somebody in Florida said global warming doesn't exist. And then we got a call from one of the coastal communities saying, can you help us with resiliency planning? Oh well. So for FCOG recently, I hope you all know what FCOG is, but I'll get there later anyway, but they asked if we put a best practice together for how to do this. For DOE, we've played around in remediation, waste management, and currently have a storage project, and also did a monitoring effort through GIST up at Hanford. So there's different DOE efforts. DOE is a hard nut to crack in some ways, because this is stakeholder engaged decision making, which means stakeholder engagement comes up front. And I think there are initiatives within DOE that are aligned with that, but going out to the facilities is much harder. There's some fear of engaging stakeholders so directly in the decision-making process. So we end up a lot more with this decide, announce, defend model, as opposed to this getting the stakeholders engaged actually more formally in the decision-making process. So it's tough, but I like to think that we'll get there eventually. So where did all this come from? I mean, to me, there's a background, a very brief history of environmental decision-making. In the beginning, there was, that was my lame attempt at chaos. So, and then Love Canal happened as a consequence of chaos. And so EPA decided to invent the DQO process, which I think was philosophically a great idea, and they attached the wrong paradigm, technical paradigm to it, which makes it unimplementable for complex sites. Not everything fits a one-sided, one-sample t-test, which is where they started. So it was not so good for complicated problems. So what happens, I think, is what's the problem in general? Poor decisions are often made. This is what we're trying to get a handle on. And I think the DQO process was trying to get a handle on this. It just couldn't really get there with attaching hypothesis testing to it as the technical paradigm. So poor decisions are made. We see conservatism everywhere, as we all sort of know, where by conservatism here, I just mean it as a term for attempts at overestimation and overprotection. This leads, as we know, to insufficient use of resources. We have very few disposal facilities, for example. Shouldn't we maximize our use of them instead of potentially throwing garbage in them? Wasting money, negative impact on upstream decisions. We make waste disposal and remediation so difficult with all the conservatism in there that that has an effect on whether we can have a nuclear energy industry or not, which I would think that a lot of people think we need one, especially in this room. So negative effects on energy policy just from making this extremely challenging in a conservative way. And, I'd argue that perhaps one of the consequences of that is something that apparently no longer exists. So maybe none of this is important after all. So like I said earlier, the issues are somewhat different in other countries. We all face different issues. Every country is set up differently for whatever reason. So there are different attributes and objectives that matter. So is there a better way overall? DQOs, what the problems are? Sure. Frame risk assessments in terms of the decision problems they really support. Don't focus only on compliance. Let's make maximum use of our facilities. And engage stakeholders in the process. It's surprising how well engaging stakeholders in the process seems to work, in our experience anyway, more with, so far with EPA and other projects. So hopefully the goal is to make better use of our resources. Paradigm shift is from turning away from a conservative analysis to a realistic one where need to be a little careful with realistic. That's why it's in quotes, because we're doing the best we can, and at the end of the day, from our perspective, models should be about what we think we know and how unsure we are about it. The decision science side is let's put why before what. And to some extent we do. I get that, but what we're trying to do here is instead of just taking a common sense approach to solving problems, let's try to formalize that. And the reason for formalizing ultimately is when there's more than just a few moving parts to a problem, we're not very good at solving them. We might like to think we are, but we're not. And so the idea of the formalism really is let's capture this in a structure that allows us to build a decision model and evaluate it and gain some insights from the interactions that are going on in there. It's very hard to do when there's more than a few moving parts just by all getting around a room and talking to each other and saying, what do you think sounds good? And, I guess as an anecdote on that, many, many years ago, our company is named for Dean Neptune, who was the so-called inventor of DQOs when he was at EPA. But Dean's wife was in a meeting at EPA many years ago where there was some discussion on what sort of risk standards should we aim for. And Joan's summary of that meeting was something like, well, what do you think? I don't know. What do you think? I don't know. What do you think? I don't know. What do you think? Well, 1 in a million sounds good. So if you have situations like that where there really is complexity or should have been complexity underlying a policy decision, then maybe some tools actually help structure what the problem should look like and have some discussion about it. So the idea ultimately is to get to optimal decision making, but optimal is it's an idealism. It's not what we're necessarily achieving, but we are within the constraints of the model we create. And so, it's optimal mathematically given the inputs. That doesn't mean it's necessarily actually optimal. It depends on what we've structured and what we've specified. But it's still an idealism and probably a better path to go down. We're still talking about safety and compliance, but what we're trying to do is create something that's technically defensible, transparent, traceable, reproducible. And there's benefits from that as well, the latter. And often projects are done and then rods are agreed upon and then 5 or 10 years later they're reopened. Well, how did the decision making happen 5 or 10 years earlier? Well, if we go down a path like this, it's all captured and you get some idea of what happened. So it helps. The title of this presentation include risk informed, because risk informed is another in term right now. So I thought, well, let's talk about what risk is a little bit. So risk is the potential or probability of gaining or losing something of value. Wikipedia says that, so it must be right. So, a risk assessment in that sense, which is now decision risk, there's really two components to it. There's the value side and the uncertainty side. And I would argue that to some extent what happens when we do conservative modeling is we're mixing the two. So I found this quote from a book by a guy by the name of Morgan Jones. Morgan Jones was actually a CIA analyst doing decision analysis. And he said this was just a recognition of the need to separate utility or value from probability. And we don't do that very well right now. So the idea, he used the word melange in here, I think. So, I mean, you can all read that. I don't need to read it out. But that's the idea behind trying to do decision analysis properly, is let's separate value judgments from the science side, essentially. So that leads me back to what we're trying to do, stakeholder engaged structured decision making. It's a framework for better decision making, at least we think so. Help solve problems with all of those nice words again. And we're trying to help individuals and groups solve their own problems. We're not trying to solve them for them. I mean, these tools are to help structure the problem, but it's their problem. Sometimes at get-togethers and parties or something, and somebody asks me, what do I do for a living? I struggle with it at times because I think, well, actually, the only reason I have a job is because, as generally, we're not very good at solving complex problems. And all we're trying to do is structure them so that they can be solved. But we're not trying to solve them for somebody. We're trying to help them solve their own problems. Okay. So the two pieces, I said it's values and science. You can think of that as well as deliberative, which is the values side, trying to support a common understanding of objectives, what matters to the stakeholders, which might be reduction in, ultimately translated to reduction in risk, minimize costs, depends who the stakeholders are, increase jobs, whatever it is. I guess more fundamental objectives would be improve human health or have a lesser effect on human health. The analytic side is the science side. This is a decision analysis which tries to put all of these pieces in their place and shows where the science modeling should come in as well. So CIDR, just that initiative at IAEA very quickly then, I said what it stands for. The member states have legacy nuclear and radioactive contamination issues. So the idea of CIDR is to improve the current levels of performance on these projects around the world. It's meant to be an action-oriented program, which is a little different for IAEA. They have a group called Technical Cooperation that does go out and actually implements at sites. But a lot of IAEA groups are aimed at providing some guidance of some kind. This one the intent is to be more action-oriented. And so there's also a large effort towards capacity building here as well. There's 4 working groups for CIDR. Our focus is the second one, but it overlaps with the others. And so this came through the idea of stakeholder engagement. So there's 2 basic components to doing this. Stakeholder engagement, when Horst got to see what we were doing, he said, that's what we need, is stakeholder engaged structured decision making. So those are the 2 aspects to it. So use the engagement effectively to actively support decision making. That's the basic idea. There was a meeting in January of this year of the OECD and NEA, which with unfamiliarity with those acronyms, they're at the bottom of the overhead. The meeting was about stakeholder support and involvement and recognizing that it's essential to the future of nuclear energy decision making. So some of you might remember Mr. Magwood, former Commissioner Magwood from the NRC. So he's now at the NEA. And this is a quote directly from him at that conference. And you can find a lot of this sort of thing right now, especially around the IAEA community, where there's clear interest and recognition of the importance of getting support from all the stakeholders to help the decision-making process. And without the buy-in from stakeholders, decisions often fall flat. So all we're trying to do, as I said, is formalize that process. I'll also mention one other thing from CIDA there. One of the higher ups at IAEA involved in CIDA, his name is Christoph Sherry, and he gives a plenary at each one of our CIDA sessions, and at one of them he said one other thing to bear in mind is that scientists think they're good at this, and they're not. So this is also a reason for reaching out, and that, it's an overgeneralization. I'm sure there's some scientists that are, but in general, we think we're good at stakeholder and communication, and perhaps we're not as good as we think we are. So that comes directly from an IAEA director as well. So part of the program for CIDA then, the idea is to build out capacity, understand that decision analysis and stakeholder engagement are not skills that are brought into this industry very much. So there needs to be a training program and a capacity building program. So CIDA 2, we called our working group 2 the Stakeholder Engagement Advisory Program. The idea is to build case studies, create tools, provide training and support, and try to help the world with their radiation problems, contamination problems. The stakeholder engagement tools, actually, England Environment Agency has developed a series of tools for stakeholder engagement that are about the best I've seen. And Kira Armstrong from that agency is a co-chair of this working group 2 along with me. So she's dealing with the stakeholder engagement tools, and I'll deal with the structured decision-making tools, and we'll merge it all together. So this is one of the things that they try to do, 7 steps to working with others. But they have a whole sequence of tools that for anybody really interested in stakeholder engagement, I'd encourage you to reach out and look at what they're doing. This is Neptune's tools, GIST as we call it, as I mentioned. I've already dealt with training and capacity building, and since I'm running out of time, I will go past that a little bit. Next steps, you heard Tamara talk about getting people involved in Modaria. Well, CIDA has a huge need to do that, but around the world. So, it's very hard, for example, for somebody like me to go to Eastern Europe and try to do some stakeholder engaged structured decision making because I don't understand the culture and I don't speak the language. So there's, to deal with issues like that, there's a heck of a lot of capacity building that's needed. Modaria, one way I thought about the interaction between CIDA and Modaria is CIDA approaches decision analysis really from the stakeholder engagement end. Modaria is more about modeling and data, but recognizing the need for decision analysis as well. And actually, I think this should happen between CIDA and Modaria. And as Tamara mentioned as well, there's a lot of overlap between different groups at IAEA. I think there's a real opportunity here to get stakeholder engagement and decision analysis and modeling all on the same page. So that last bullet then becomes relevant. SDM helps organize stakeholder engagement, i.e. values, and modeling in a decision analysis framework. The US, the best practice on structured decision making, we wrote a best practice, it got approved, except they said we really need an example. Okay, we'll try and create a DOE relevant example. But doing that is a little hard because it's not easy to get client approval to publish something like this, because then it looks like we're making decisions within a best practice for that specific site. So we made up a uranium mill tailings problem. It's actually probably more based on a site in Slovenia than it is anywhere else, but I think it has aspects to it that are relevant to some sites over here, whether they're mill tailings sites or not. So this is just simple. We made it simple. The idea here is there's some objectives or attributes of interest. You go through an objective preference ranking scheme. We have some tools to help do that. Then you get preference weighting across the different attributes. After you get preference weighting, you're trying to tie objectives to options. So what options do you have to achieve those objectives? That's the basic idea. What options do you have to minimize impact on intruders in this particular case? Well, fence the site, remove the tailings. They'll have impacts on intruders, at least on their health effects. The idea here is then that you have options which in our software we colored the options as yellow. Those are options. The green is objectives. These are the things we're trying to achieve. And the pink nodes is where the models are. And the models could be, heck, a GoldSim model or a pFlowTran model. It's whatever's needed to connect the options to the objectives so you can actually evaluate the system. They can obviously be much simpler models. They could just be simple probability statements. They can be whatever they need to be to address the problem. So that's a very quick overview of what the software does. This is the mean results from running that particular example. I said I based it sort of on Slovenia, and this example as it's presented said go clean up the site. Don't try to minimize access as well because it doesn't buy you anything. You've cleaned it up. Do nothing is also an option, which is actually the preferred option at Slovenia. So the curiosity here is at Slovenia, this is a site that's on the side of a hill with water running underneath it, so eventually it's going to end up in the stream, down gradient of the site. And by just down gradient, I mean like 100 yards down gradient. Then it's going to go into the river system and hit the local community. So why don't they want to clean it up? Well, this goes back to different countries have different issues to deal with, and they don't have money to clean it up. So while they understand what the risks are, their path forward is likely to be, we can't clean it up until it fails, because once it fails, we'll get disaster funding to help clean it up. Different issues to deal with, different places around the world. I thought I'd throw this one up last. This might be a reach in some ways, but I don't know how many of you were at the National Cleanup Workshop, but I know a few of you were. This is what I heard here when Jim Owendoff gave his first presentation there on the first day. He gave about 15, 20 minutes. But he actually talked about the need to involve stakeholders and look at a broader set of alternatives to help us. I mean, this is really trying to get at DOE's environmental liability and recognizing that we might need to do some things differently than we're doing. I was standing next to Sonny Goldston as Jim Owendoff was giving that presentation, and I said to Sonny, heck, I could have been up there saying those few things. I'm not going to claim I'd have said anything else that Jim Owendoff said, but maybe those two, because they related so closely to what we're trying to do. Whether that's real or not is another issue, but I heard those things, I think. So the basic idea is to find ways to be more efficient and cost-effective in decision-making. So, okay, that was the last one, Mick.
Thank you, Paul.
Paul, this is a general question about decision analysis. Rick Kosick, GoldSim. Involving stakeholders is great, but you're making an assumption that the stakeholder wants to play. And so if they have an ulterior motive that they don't state, how do you deal with that in any kind of decision analysis framework?
If they don't want to play? So one thing that I maybe should clarify is stakeholders doesn't necessarily mean the public. It means stakeholders. So my guess is your question is aimed more at some members of the public.
It could be, but it doesn't necessarily. I'm just saying that doesn't the stakeholder, what if the stakeholder has an ulterior motive that they don't lay on the table? How do you address that?
Yeah, how do you address that? How can anyone address that in any situation? I mean, is this a panacea? No. It's doing the best we can under the circumstances that we have. And so I think that's a hard issue. If somebody doesn't want to show up, they don't show up and they're not involved. But then more fool them, because now they're not engaged in a process that's going to go forward and support decision making. I think a different and related issue that's also a challenge is what you really are dealing with is different stakeholders that have competing objectives. And that's one thing that we found actually using tools like this and engaging them all together has been very helpful, partly because the elicitation approach, I guess, we take is to get everything on the table. And then as everything is on the table and they see that their inputs are actually incorporated in what we're doing, but then they also get to hear how their inputs are valued. And that's actually been critical to mitigating the effects of extreme views, is they can be at the table and see that, you know, again, we're not trying to solve the problem for them, we're trying to help the group solve their own problem. And it actually is very powerful for those extreme views to be mitigated by the rest of the group. So, and that, you know, that's what we see on the EPA projects that we've worked on to date.
Let me add just a little thought on that. Judging by the feedback that we have received in this forum, for instance, you know, we are seeing increased participation from the state regulators as well as, you know, the agencies, other agencies. Also, Paul mentioned about the DOE, you know, National Cleanup Workshop. As some of you have witnessed, the attendance has doubled, almost doubled in the last couple of years. So there's a lot of interest once people see the value of participation to participate.